the other issue is like when people tell me, oh, Oakland doesn't want to keep the A's, they don't care about sports, or oh, the A's don't want to stay here, they're just trying to go to Las Vegas. That's all total bunk because they thought they needed like $352 million in offside funds. Oakland did it. They delivered, right? Like they did exactly what the A's asked them to do. But then inflation hit and interest rates went up and everything went bad with like materials and all these other things. And are we just like also, I feel like we just totally gloss over all the time. There was a global pandemic in the middle of all of this, right? Like that's not the A's fault. Right. That's not the city's fault.
When we look back and say this has been going on for years now, there was a full year, basically most of 2020 and into the beginnings of 21, where life was not operating normally in most regards. And for March, April, May, June, July of 2020, I could barely care about sports, let alone baseball, let alone the future home of the Oakland A's. Like it went very back burner. You're right, and had to resurface. So I'm not making every excuse in the book, but you're right. Perspective on that is important.
Yeah, I'd say so. And it's funny, it just hit me like as I was delivering that point. Everybody has some criticism about this and that, but yes, the pandemic literally hit in the middle of this very specific Howard Terminal process, and that really threw things for a loop because it made everything more expensive. It really messed with a lot of different things, and so yeah, I think that's a factor too. But there's several remaining grants. I actually pulled it up on my phone. They got about $140 million right here on this list that they're trying to acquire, and all of these federal funds applications were due last year. So they're all in, they're just waiting to see the results. And if they can land some of these $140 million worth of grants, I think that is a very significant amount. Like if we were to estimate how much money is left between, paying for the offsite versus not, I'd say it's about maybe 300 million right now. And if you take 140 million out of that, it starts becoming a bit more manageable in terms of whether or not John Fisher wants to pony it up and finance it, or whether or not the city could come up with a limited obligation bond, one unlike the one that the Oakland Raiders used to build Mount Davis and screw the taxpayers. A limited obligation bond would not hurt the taxpayers in the same way. And maybe that's sellable if it's, in the 150 million range as opposed to 300.
I wonder how either close or if the number has to be absolutely met and matched and maybe even exceeded. Like if ultimately we come back and we hear, okay, the infrastructure is going to cost $497 million. So does it mean before we can actually shake hands, sign papers, get into binding vote season, like officially and do it, does that money entirely need to be secured, or can it be like, well, we're 20 short, but we got it. We'll figure this out. Or does it need to be over, like to protect for future inflation and maybe a couple percent per year of expected inflation? So I'm at a loss to that. I need to know more about that. I know you and I would love to ask specific questions about stuff like that if there was the opportunity.
Would answer, right?
But there's not a lot of opportunity for these types of questions, and you kind of wonder behind the scenes, like, is this the stuff that's actually being hashed out right now?
Well, therein lies the problem. You see why both sides would be gun shy on a deal. You see why John Fisher would say, hey, you guys didn't want our term sheet. You made your own, and your term sheet said you were paying for the offsite funds.
Right.
So now you're asking me to pay for it? No, thank you.
No, that is a factor. You would see why
the city would say, well, we have X amount of grants, but we don't have quite enough, or maybe we've raised enough, but we don't know if the price is going to go even higher down the road. And if we agree and we say yes, and then all of a sudden the price explodes again, what happens to our taxpayers? What happens to our general fund? So I think you could see why both sides would be afraid to make a deal at this point. And, I think maybe that limited obligation bond or some type of bond they could create would at least protect them from the overages. Also, like, let's be honest, construction. I mean, I've done it on my house. You've done construction on your house. And it doesn't always end up the cost they think it is.
Never.
And let's just say they think they have all the money, then they get in the ground and something else pops up. Well, then they got a whole other can of worms. And so I could see the hesitation on both sides.
You want to make sure when you start a project of this magnitude that, number one, if you start construction, you will finish construction. There will not be anything that gets in your way, either environmentally or financially. Number two, you just don't want to get, if you're the city of Oakland, and they've already declared this, I recognize it and I fully agree. they don't want to eventually have to be held responsible for the final stretch, finishing up the final amount. And I don't think that's unreasonable of them to ask that, of them to demand that. So it's a lot of T's and a lot of I's to cross and dot here. And I think that's been a part of the equation, but maybe that's not the entire part of why we're still here going around in circles.